To start off with, when you're helping someone in your home, you need to start by making sure that your bucket is full. And what I mean by that is making sure that you're in an okay place to help others. A lot of folks tell me, well, I will take care of myself when my family's taken care of, when my kids are okay. I got to tell you to be careful about that. One of the problems is if you're focused on supporting others, but you don't have your own safety net, you can end up being in mental health trouble yourself, which might mean that you can't help those you care for. It might mean that you end up in crisis. Maybe it's delayed, but could end up with you in crisis. So it's one of those things. There's a saying in the emergency medicine world that a dead EMT helps nobody. And that's very true in mental health as well. If you're not in a good place, you can't help someone the way you could. And so it is important to have that safety net. I'm not saying don't care for your family members, but do make sure that you have your own support systems. Do know that death is going to be different for everybody. Not everyone's going to experience it the same way, not even the same family. In this case, I'm not being very specific on what might be a home or a household because that can vary so much, especially in this day and age. So it may be that your home has a grandparent living there. It may be that you have stepchildren or step parent. It may be that you have friends that are so close with their family. I'm certainly not going to tell you that's not family. Whatever you define as family is family to me. So, in social work, we talk about systems theory. We talk about all the systems we're involved in and how we influence them and they influence us. With grief, particularly for a family, these are some of the influences that we see affecting a family. And some of them will affect certain families more than others. So, a family that's maybe dealing with a death that involved maybe some legal aspect or criminal aspect is more likely to be impacted by court laws and policies. A family who is very involved in their work would have that be more impactful. So I, for example, am marrying a firefighter. So that comes with a lot of things because work is such a huge part of our family. But there also could be cultural norms, things specifically to your community with grief. Sometimes we have a community event that causes a family grief. I know that some of the things we've had recently in Utah that have been really stressful have been some stressful deaths, some stressful changes in some of our culture. And so that can impact a family and cause grief. So these are just some of them. Again, not all of them affect every family, but they're things to look at when you're helping your own family is are these in balance? Are some of them more impacted than the other? So as a family, when we mourn, and we talked about mourning rituals last time, there are behaviors we engage in to express the grief or loss. This helps us heal. It helps us feel validated because we're finding a way to express this feeling that we have that someone we care for is no longer here or no longer in the way they used to be. So it is an important part of human nature. When we share grief with somebody, it does help us feel like we're not alone. Grief can be very isolating when it's not shared. But in a family, not everyone's going to experience it the same way. Sometimes I have parents that very much stay stoic throughout grief, whereas children maybe do not. I have teenagers that absolutely refuse to talk about it and just keep saying, I'm fine, I'm okay, it's not a big deal. I sometimes have young children who are not affected at all. I even have families that say, well, something's wrong. Shouldn't my 4-year-old be more upset? 4-year-olds don't always understand grief or death. So there is some variance, and that can also change over time. Sometimes in a family, what we'll see is one person struggling, and when they're doing better, someone else will struggle because they now feel safe to do so. So that does happen in family dynamics, which is unique to families, especially if you have a family with multiple children. That's one of the places I see that the most, where maybe you have one child that's really upset about the loss and really expressing themselves, talking to people, and needing more care, whereas maybe the other children are not. But when that child's finally doing well again, you might all of a sudden see this delayed grief where the other children now feel able to express how they're feeling. So, some to watch for as a family. It is really normal, but it's also important that we should never force people to feel feelings. We should never force people to do mourning rituals. This can cause us to actually feel more hurt, more pain, and even resentment and loss of that family connection. Now, not all families are close, not all families are healthy. I'm a therapist, so I see a lot of families that maybe don't get along so well, maybe has some bad trauma in their history. So sometimes you have a family like that. I'd love to tell you that when there's a loss in a family, that somehow there's this magic that makes everyone get along. That does not usually happen. Sometimes, sometimes I do see families all of a sudden really just pull it together and be there for each other. Quite often, because people are hurting, I see people actually lash out more. So something to be aware of. We have a lot of webinars on setting boundaries with toxic people. I highly recommend them. We're not going to specifically focus on toxic family behaviors today, but that's something to keep in mind when you're mourning as a family. So some do's and don'ts, some of these we talked about before. It's important to let someone mourn in the way that's easiest for them, not for you. I know that for some folks that can be really hard because there's family traditions, maybe spiritual traditions, maybe an expectation that this member of my family will be a pallbearer, this member will speak at the funeral or be present at the viewing, and they just don't want to. It is important to let people mourn in the way that's healthiest for them and not give in to social pressure because you can make it feel more like something to resent and more hurtful when you push. And so you do want to be very careful with that. We've talked a lot about how grief does not have a timeline. It never really ends. It changes. It doesn't end. There's never going to be a day where we just go, yep, this person's gone and I'm okay with it. That's just not how it works. We may feel better about it. We may not cry as much, but we're always going to feel some pain at that loss, and that is normal and natural. So there isn't really a timeline. There isn't a, aren't you over this yet? That's just not a healthy view to have. Always be willing to help, but focus on what they say will help. One thing that I run into with families is people saying, I know how you feel because you share a family member that was lost, or a friend, or someone that affects the family. When you say, I know how you feel, it can feel very minimizing. It can feel like somehow my feelings are less than yours. And so it's something you want to be very careful with. So even if I have someone in a family that both lost a parent, saying, I know how you feel, they have a different relationship with that parent, even if they're your sibling. And so being very cautious, instead saying, I know that I feel sad. I know that I feel guilty. I feel frustrated. Do you feel frustrated? These are better ways to approach it because we don't want to make anyone feel like they can't express their feelings. In families, I have some folks that say, I'm not sad. I have folks that say, I am absolutely devastated, and everything in between. And so it's very important to respect where people are at. Be patient and don't compare grief. We're going to talk about some specific types of grief that happen in families. There's this temptation to say it could be worse, or at least it's not this, or, well, that loss is bigger than my loss, so I can't mourn. There isn't a measure for grief. Grief is grief. If I've lost a beloved pet, that's a big deal. And someone will say, well, that's less of a loss than losing a parent or a child. Maybe, but less is a very funny thing. If we're feeling absolutely devastated, we're devastated. Saying that yours is less than or yours is more than is a way to imply that there's a certain way to do this, and there isn't. We shouldn't make people feel bad about their feelings. There isn't a comparison. Loss is loss, and it's painful and a human experience that we wouldn't wish on anybody, but one that we all go through at some point in our lives. So family pets are usually the first loss that a person experiences. It's because animals don't live as long. It's also because sometimes even if you don't have a pet, there's a beloved animal that you feel close to. I sometimes will have classrooms that have lost a classroom pet. I sometimes will see folks that have family mourning over more working animals, so livestock, or even a neighbor's pet. These are very real losses. I've had folks say, well, it's just an animal. It might be for you. It doesn't mean it is that way for everybody. A lot of us have very strong bonds with a pet, and a pet is a very vulnerable being. Animals are very vulnerable in our minds compared to humans because they can't speak for themselves, because they are less able to defend themselves. So this does tend to impact people. Want proof of that? Ask anyone if they like a movie where a dog dies. Most of us absolutely hate that in a film. There's a reason it's so upsetting. It's important to treat these losses as valuable, not to treat them as less. It's good to have family or personal traditions. There's not a lot of guidelines or traditional mourning rituals, but families do well to have their own. I know some that do little memorial stones in yards. I know some that have pet beds turned into certain memorial pieces, like stuffed animals. I know folks that will donate to certain animal causes, such as Say Best Friends here in Salt Lake for their animal in name of their animal. Those are all really great ways to mourn a family pet. And I would also say it's important to remember whether you're a child or an adult, losing a pet can be a big deal. So we got a couple chats. Let me just check those real quick. I try so hard to listen to these. Okay, so just someone asking if they have any questions. All right. Losing a parent. No matter what age you lose a parent, it's a very difficult transition. I have had folks come in here that would be considered seniors, that losing a parent is super impactful. And it's one that lingers in our lives. It's a huge loss, it's a huge change. I would even say it's a huge change, even if you didn't have a good relationship with that parent, because losing that parent means that there is no changing that relationship anymore. It is a change. It is very hard. I also have folks that say, what about a divorce? Well, when you're mourning divorce, that's one loss. But when you lose a parent during a divorce or after a divorce, it is particularly painful because you're dealing with two losses. A loss of something that you depended on and a loss of that parent. Research has shown that no matter how old you are, the majority of children secretly wish their parents would get back together. And they've looked at this 20, 30 years later. The exception has been some really nasty abuse cases, but even some of the milder ones, kids still wish secretly that their parents would get back together, even if they know that it doesn't work. And so it really finalizes that loss for divorce. It is important to be supportive. I know that during divorces, sometimes the loss of the other parent can be a relief, even because of all the difficulty with custody, hurt feelings. But it is important to recognize that speaking ill of them can only add to that grief for a child. And by the way, this is true for adults too. I have had adults whose parents have divorced and they really do struggle with that loss. It doesn't matter how old you are, it is really hard to lose a parent. See that there's another. How does one handle the abuse situation? Whew, well, if it's a situation where there's been abuse between the parents and you have a kid asking or feeling certain feelings about the grief, it's important to let them guide the dialogue because with children, their feelings are going to change a lot. And I have this little slide here a bit on brain development. Children's brains are a little different than us adults. Usually, we're a little more able to understand gray areas. Things like I can love this person and be afraid of them. I can feel angry, even hateful towards this person, but I can still miss them. Those are concepts that adults are a little better at understanding. Children tend to have trouble with this. And so when I'm working with a kid who has lost a parent, who was abusive to them or their other parent. One of the things I do is let them guide that dialogue. I even do that with adults that come in that say, my parent passed, but they were abusive, and I feel bad that I feel so good about them being gone. I feel so angry. I feel so sad. I really let them guide that dialogue. And that can be hard because certainly I'm a human. I have opinions and thoughts, but it's really important to let them guide the dialogue. If they say that they're feeling sad and they want to focus on how much they miss that parent, that is the direction to go. If they're saying, I feel happy and that makes me feel bad, go with that. Go with, okay, it's okay that you feel happy because you have a lot of feelings. You want to talk about those. With younger children, I find that sometimes letting them engage in drawing their feelings instead of talking them just because they don't have the verbiage yet to express some of those feelings. I also find engaging in certain films and books can be really helpful. On my bookshelf, I keep a lot of books on death, a lot of books on divorce that are geared towards children for that reason. There's also a lot of good movies and shows. There's a little screenshot here from Sesame Street. In this particular scene, they are talking about a death and it is very impactful for Elmo. So for some of my preschoolers, even though I know it can feel weird to talk to preschoolers about death, these are important things that they have questions about. Now, there is some episodes that get into abuse and a little bit into some other things that are a little more taboo for kids. So if you do have a preschooler, it's a great resource. Now, if you're the parent in that situation, I would say one of the things that's really important is to have that support system for yourself. Because when your spouse was abusive to you and they have passed, you're gonna have some complicated feelings, and that is normal. But you're gonna have everyone telling you how you should do it. And the truth is, no one can tell you what's right to do. So it's really important to have someone who is in your corner or neutral. And neutral is kind of hard to find. That's why I usually recommend seeing a therapist or even just a person that is a counselor or someone that can listen without judgment if you have such a person in your life. We all need that. We need someone that's not going to tell us what to do, but really let us explore what we feel is best. With kids, it's really important to give them a lot of leeway. Grief is really hard for kids. They're very black and white thinkers. Death is very new to children usually, and they're going to ask questions again and again to try to figure it out. And so it's important to be patient and supportive. Teens can be really tricky. Teens do experience deaths, and they usually have some different ones. Okay, so I do have someone asking a question about adult children and some stuff with that. I'm gonna say that's more something that we should do in a counseling session so I can speak to specifics. Because with this training, I always want to make sure that I'm giving information that's useful for everybody, and I don't want anyone to share information that they'd be uncomfortable sharing. So I'd highly suggest that if it's something more specific, that'd be a great opportunity to set even just one session with a counselor to work on how to handle that specific issue. So with teens, teens tend to be more close with friends than with their families, and that is really normal for that age. That does not mean they don't need family support. They also tend to not want to express feelings openly, or if they do, it tends to be anger, and that is really normal. So it's important to let them have that space within reason. We can't let our teens be unsafe or do anything dangerous, but it's really important that we give them support in what areas do they need support with. And I find that with teens, if you check on them and just say, hey, do you need anything? That can be enough to show them that you are supportive, that you care about their needs. You don't have to force anything. If they choose to not take support, if you're just asking, even offering, that shows so much respect for them. Most teens want to be treated like an adult. They aren't adults, they don't get adult privileges, but they want to be treated like an adult. And that's how we would treat an adult. We would give them respect and support, but we wouldn't force anything. So it's really the best thing to do with teens. So, loss of a grandparent, this is usually the first human loss a person experiences, mostly because grandparents are older and are more likely to die. Now, we all die at some point, but this is usually the first loss that we experience. I do find that a lot of folks that come to counseling are more hurt by people minimizing that loss. It doesn't matter if it was because of age or if they've been suffering, it's still extremely painful. And so sometimes we have this temptation to minimize, to make it out like, you know what, at least they went quickly, at least they are no longer suffering. Humans sometimes say dumb things to try to fix it. We talk about that a lot in these presentations, and there's a lot on that in prior presentations. But it's important not to minimize the loss, even if it's a grandparent. It's also something that for a lot of us makes us start talking and thinking about our own losses coming up and our own mortality. There's also something to different relationships. So the relationship I have with a grandparent is going to be different than my parents' relationship with that same grandparent as their parent, which might be wildly different than one of my cousins. And so there's something to remember with that. We're going to have different memories, different relationships, different levels of hurt. And that doesn't mean less than. That doesn't mean that we need to push someone to feel a certain way. But everyone has a different relationship. And with multi-generational, we knew them at different stages of life. And so just keep that in mind when there's a loss of a grandparent, particularly when I run to cases where maybe a parent was abusive and when they became a grandparent, they were a very different person. And I find that can be really hard on the parent because they're feeling different feelings than their child. And that's where making sure that, again, you have that support for yourself is really important. So, loss of significant other, some of the things I want to point out, there isn't a less than here. I sometimes have folks say that if it's a really young relationship, such as those with teens, that it shouldn't be a big deal. What I have found is that with teens, they actually tend to feel their feelings a lot stronger. When you're young, you've had less experience with dating and love. And so it does feel like a bigger deal when you have a breakup or a loss at a young age. And so it's very important not to invalidate or make that less than. Even if you've been married 40, 50 years, that pain is real. And there isn't a guideline on when you're going to be okay. I have folks that are all the time asking me, what's the guideline on when I date again? What's the guideline on when I stop wearing black? When is it okay for me to have fun again? There isn't a rule. Now, society will sometimes push a certain rule. There were times in our history where there was a very big pressure, particularly for women and widows of female gender, that you had to not go out and do fun things. You had to isolate. You had to wear black. This is not necessarily the case anymore. There's a few cultures that still practice some very specific mourning rules for widows, but there is no hard, fast rule. Now, I think if you're feeling very pressured, it's good to talk with someone neutral, someone that's gonna really talk to you about your feelings and not push their own agenda. And sometimes that's family, sometimes it's not. But being able to have that is really important when you've lost a spouse because every person's going to have advice. And that doesn't mean it's advice that works for you. So I actually did not have this slide originally. It was something that someone else brought up with me when I was having a session the last couple months. And so I ended up putting the slide in here. So for families, there is a lot of stuff that we don't talk about that is kind of red tape, admin stuff that makes it particularly hard. And I've just listed some of the ones that come to mind. If this is a topic that has a lot of interest, I'm happy to do a whole presentation on it, but it's something that I'm often helping folks with because this minutia, it's real and it's expensive, it's time consuming, it can be very difficult. I have a lot of families that do things like how do I make someone happy who wants this when the other person wants someone different? If my loved one who's passed specifically wants this type of funeral, but the spouse is pushing this kind of funeral, what do I do? When do I have to get rid of things that belong to my loved one? Do I ever have to get rid of them? Is it only when my house is too full of things? Do I have to change the house? When do I take down pictures of my loved one? Do I do it when I remarry? If I ever remarry? Do I leave them forever? Is it unhealthy to hang on to these things? Dealing with insurances. I can tell you that dealing with all the estate and property insurances, informing those need to be informed, is one of the biggest headaches I have ever found with a death. I'm not saying the emotional stuff isn't a big deal, because it is, but I think it took me a year and a half to settle all the stuff with my grandparents' estate. I can very vividly remember having to get help just to deal with a timeshare they'd purchased in the 90s. And if you ever need advice on that, hit me up because that was a doer. But having to handle these things is really stressful. And it's almost like ripping the band-aid off of that wound again and again. Having to explain to a debtor that no, this person has passed, please stop calling. We have paid the bill. Here's the proof of death. It's really painful. Now, if you have family or friends that you trust that can take some of that off your plate, please do. Please do. It is so much. And it's a real thing that affects families. Money is a big thing that affects families with a death because it is expensive. It is truly expensive to have funerals, to buy all the things that you need for a funeral, to be able to figure out things, sometimes having to involve lawyers. It's hard. And with a family, what I find is that sometimes you don't take care of something because you're just not in the place to do it. Sometimes the stress causes family conflict and makes your support system not as supportive as it could be. Again, if this is something that people really have an interest in, I help families with this kind of resource stuff all the time as part of counseling. I'm happy to do a full presentation on it if there's an interest. So loss of a sibling, particularly with children, is extremely difficult. Children have trouble understanding that they are not immortal. And so loss of pet, scary. Loss of a older adult, like a grandparent, scary. Loss of a sibling is much more terrifying to a child because that is something way closer to their age group. Children can benefit from attending funerals and other events like that, but that does vary. I have some children that absolutely cannot handle those kind of things. I have some that it's really helpful in their mourning process and their healing process. I usually recommend to families be as honest as you can while being age appropriate when talking about a death. And there are some that are more taboo or traumatic. If you lose an older sibling, for example, to an overdose, that's a tricky topic to talk about with a younger child. But it's still very important to be as honest as possible. One of the reasons for this is if you're not honest, they will sometimes find out in other ways and lose trust in their caregivers. So I've had a few cases over the years where because the death was a particularly traumatic one or maybe a little taboo, the family just didn't tell a child what actually happened and just never got around to it before someone else did. Children are very smart, so I've had kids find things themselves on the internet. I have had things found out from an older sibling or a cousin. I've even, in some cases, had to be overhearing adults talking about it, like teachers or aunts. And that child can feel very lied to and very upset. There's no hard, fast rule, but I do recommend being as honest as possible because that reduces that risk. Again, children are very smart. The one that comes to mind was a case where a parent died in a very disturbing way, and it did make several news outlets. And the child was very smart. And when they got to a certain age and were using computers, they Googled their own name, and the first thing that comes up is all these news articles. And that child was furious at their surviving parent. And rebuilding that trust was very difficult because that child felt so betrayed. So I do caution, do not hide things. It's okay if you want to tailor it for an age, but if you hide things that can come back to bite that relationship. Now, adults losing a sibling is very difficult too. It can change how you feel about yourself, your role. I know a lot of siblings, whether they're older or younger siblings, feel intense guilt when there's a loss of a sibling. Should I have been there for them more? Could I provided more care? Could I have prevented this loss? These are real feelings. And a sibling feels a certain protectiveness often of another sibling. Again, regardless of whether you're an oldest, youngest, or middle. So these are very real things. Even if you are in an advanced stage, whether you're 60, 70, it's still really hard to lose a sibling. And so it's important to have that support. See, there's a couple things in the chat. Yeah, looks like someone else has had that same experience. Someone would like me to do that red tape one. Yeah, I would be happy to put that together. I know that is really tough stuff. And yeah, you can lose that trust and really cause harm when you're not honest. Um, I really, again, recommend being as honest as possible for an age group. You certainly don't need to sit down with, say, a 4-year-old and say, by the way, this is how your older sibling passed, and here's all the gruesome details. But again, as honest as you can be. And if you ever need help with framing that, there's a lot of resources on that. Sesame Street Communities is great for preschoolers. There's a lot of books on the topic. And the counselor is happy to help you really tailor that for just the right wording for the age group. We have to study development for that reason. Yep. Oh yeah. Oh, that's one that I've heard before. Looking up an obituary. Oh, finances, fightings with families. Yes, do recognize that for kids, particularly teens, people can look up these things, and they do. There's some real cyberbullying that can come with that. Teenagers can be really mean. They can be brutal, and it shouldn't happen, flat out. But sometimes to feel in control or to bully someone, someone will use someone's death or something that's public. The media does a decent job usually in not listing a child's name in a news story, but they are often listed in the obituary. And so if you're smart and a little vicious, you can make those connections. I have absolutely seen cases of kids bullied about the loss of a parent or a sibling, particularly if it was in a taboo way. So it is important to keep that in mind that these things are very public. Loss of a baby or child. So we are going to be doing a webinar on taboo loss. I can't remember if it's the next one or the one after that, but we will be discussing a lot of the different taboo losses. And loss of a baby or child is very taboo in our society. We know that many women, many families go through miscarriages, stillbirths, death via SIDS. These are very difficult losses. And most people are so uncomfortable with them that we're not given the space to talk about it. And so that's why it's considered so taboo. It's something that is really important that we see and recognize. I know a lot of us go, well, what do I say to someone that lost a kid? There's nothing I can say to make it better. And that right there is the thing to remember. No, there's nothing you can say to make it better. Don't try to make it better. Don't try to fix it. This is not something to fix. This is a very real pain for a very good reason. Instead, be supportive because it's a grief they're going to carry their whole life. All grief is grief we carry through our whole lives. Loss of a baby or child is particularly painful. And so be supportive. Don't try to fix it. We're going to get more into this in some of our taboo one. I'm also looking to make a whole one on loss of a baby or child. I think it's a very good topic that we do need to talk about more. It's one that I'm just taking more time to put together, so it probably won't be till next year. But I do promise we are doing that one specifically. If there is a loss of a baby or child, it is beneficial to talk to siblings about it. Even an infant can tell when a family member's upset. So children as young as 2 can tell when their parents are upset. And again, we just talked about don't lie to kids. So being honest as much as you can, letting it be part of the mourning process is very healthy. The kid may remember it differently a little later. They may feel more grief when they're older, but I find letting them be included and it's really important. I do have kids that come in here and will sometimes say to me, well, I have 2 brothers and then I have a sister who's in heaven. And that's not bad. It's not bad that they know that. It really is beneficial for them to be able to start exploring that. And for a kid, it's very good not to fall into some of these taboos. Also, we got a couple chats. So one person's asking, is it okay to say there's more to the story and details I'm not telling you? So that can be really good. You're gonna have to base it a little bit on your own kid. So one of the things I like to do with talking to kids about a loss or something traumatic that might be difficult, there's a method that's kind of called the Mr. Rogers method or the Sesame Street method. It's really kind of cool where you take a lesson that you have to teach a kid and tailor it for that kid. And so, for example, if I was talking to, let's say, a 4-year-old about the loss of an older sibling via, let's pick one really taboo, let's say suicide. That's a really tough one to talk to a kid about. I would want to give them as much information as I can. I sometimes avoid saying, I'll tell you more when you're ready, because if you've talked to a little kid, but what about now? What about now? I want to know now. I want to know now. It's a very little kid thing to do. So I try not to leave too much open-ended. So how I would talk to that child about an older sibling's suicide is I would say, so you know that your brother died. Your brother was dealing with an illness. It's not an illness like a cold. It's not something that, I can cough and you will get it. It's something that happens in the brain and our feelings. And when that happens, they have a hard time feeling happy. They have a hard time talking to people. And so, because of this illness, your brother died and no longer is among the living. Now, do you have questions about that? And I usually let them kind of guide me a little bit there. Sometimes, now we do know from research, I actually taught a class on this a couple years back, that children actually understand suicide and know 2 methods by age 7. So if I have a kid spout back with, well, I heard that my brother committed suicide, what does that mean? Then I would try to answer that again in an age appropriate way of, well, suicide is when someone who's dealing with that illness we just talked about, and it's so bad that they don't think they can live or be around anymore. And so they hurt themselves so they don't have to feel their feelings anymore. It's a very scary thing. And I wish that we'd been able to help your brother more. But sometimes people don't ask for help. And so I try to make it a dialogue as much as I can, even with little kids. You do tailor the language a little bit. And sometimes it's okay to say, you know what? I know that's a question you want the answer to. I can't answer that for you. That is a legit answer. And it's an honest answer to say, I cannot answer that for you. Or that is not an answer that you are ready to hear. So it's okay to do that. Just know that you're going to have a kid poke. Because that's what little kids do. They poke buttons. And so if you feel stuck with the poking, don't be afraid to ask for help. But know that that's part of just what little kids do. They poke. And so if they poke, you didn't do it wrong. It's just part of their development. It looks like we had a couple more chats come up. On loss of babies, yes, it never goes away. And there was a time period where we really mistreated many women who lost babies. I can remember reading an entry from my grandmother. She passed away many years ago now, but she had a stillbirth in the 1950s. And that was handled in a way that just frankly makes me want to throw up. because that's how they handled things back then. And that horrible practice has in some ways passed down from generations of not talking about it, not acknowledging this grief. I have had people, perhaps well-meaning, say things like, well, you can have more, or, well, they didn't get to live anyways. They may have meant well, but those are hurtful, horrible things to say to a human being. It's important to acknowledge these losses and no, you don't get over it. You get through it. You don't get over it. Oh, someone who's talking about losing a daughter, I am so sorry. That is, whew, it's a tough one. And again, the goal is not to make it better. It's not about how can I fix this because you can't fix something like that. It's not meant to be fixed, but you can help someone get through it. And that's what healing is. It's not, I'm over it. It's, I'm getting through it. Ooh, so someone asking about what to say when your kids are okay saying it, but your spouse isn't. Ooh, that's a tricky one. That might be something more specific to check with a therapist on. My general advice there is make sure that it's not something that's going to get you in trouble with any divorce decree or custody agreement, because sometimes that is included. I also find that that's a great time to use a neutral party. And that could be a counselor. That can also be a book or a film, because then you're not the one who is explaining it. You are letting a neutral party that they cannot punish have it. It's really hard, but with spouses, sometimes they have their own feelings about grief and how it should be shared, maybe even their own experience that makes that difficult. Sometimes that's even a marriage counseling discussion, even if it's a spouse that you're no longer with. Sometimes sitting together with somebody and talking that out. It really is healthy and important for children to be able to know this stuff. But yeah, not every adult feels the same way. Oh, lost a son. I am so sorry. That is a horrible loss.
Hey Elizabeth, I
Yes.
had a couple questions come in
Oh, sure.
me directly. So one of them was, could I get clarification on how grief is defined? Is it an emotion or a process or both?
Ooh, that's a good one. Um, Grief, and I think I defined it in my very first presentation. Grief is the emotions and experience. Mourning is something that we express to heal. So grief is the feelings and experience, because grief can also happen without a loss, whereas mourning is how we express that grief. I hope that answers that question. Someone talking about religion. Religion is sometimes a comfort for some, and sometimes it's not. Everyone's different, and there's really no one answer on how someone can grieve. Religion can be a great support. I do find that some people do not find it supportive, and if that's the case, it's good not to push it. Yeah, someone talking about the phrase getting through it. I know it's one that some people like, some don't. The reason I use getting through it is because a lot of folks that come in to see me are talking about getting over. And so sometimes saying getting through is one of the ways that they can feel better because they like this idea of they're getting through this moment, not through the whole thing. And so we do use that phrase. It's not a phrase that works for everybody, though. Someone,
I had
oh,
another
go for it.
question. So
Mhm.
someone said, do you know if there are any specific laws on how much bereavement time you receive off of work?
So we talked about that a little bit in the presentation on creating a workplace culture around grief and how you handle that in the workplace. There are not specific laws on it. The the exception with that is that there is FMLA laws. So if, for example, you qualify for FMLA under the grief because of mental health that has come from that loss or impact on your physical health due to that loss, that is protected by law. That does have very specific limits of time. But other than that, in the US of A, as far as I know, there's no specific laws on how much bereavement time you can have. It is based on workplace to workplace. That's very possible that I don't know of a specific state that might have something in place, but last I checked, there is nothing like that. Yep. So someone asked, always worry about saying the wrong thing. And so that is something that we do get into in some of our other presentations. My advice on that is just to be present. Don't try to say something to fix it. A lot of us feel this pressure to say the right thing. But remember, you don't have to fix this. It's not something to be fixed. It's something they genuinely feel and that they are experiencing for good reason. So instead of saying something like, this is going to get easier, or I feel for you, sometimes it's better to say, I don't have the words to make this better. What can I do to support you? And even saying, hey, I know that I can't make this loss easier, but I know you like my kugel. I was thinking of baking you one. Would you like that? Hey, I know you're dealing with a lot right now. Would it help if I kind of gave you a free pass to ask me to watch the kids one night for you and your spouse to be able to have some time together? Hey, can I cover a shift for you when you need it? These are things that are very helpful. And I find that sometimes just being sad with them is okay. And that's one of the things with being with somebody, not trying to fix or push it forward, just being there. Yep. Sometimes a hug, no words. Yep. Oh, yay. I like that plan. Just feed people. Don't have to say a word. I'm with you. I love to eat my feelings. Yeah. There are a lot of people that don't like talking about loss and finding someone you can talk to. A therapist is a good thing. I can understand why you would not want to see a therapist that said starting to get past this. That's not a good phrase to use. It has an implication that's not healthy. Um, if you feel comfortable, sometimes it's even worth saying to that therapist, that's not helpful because of this. Because sometimes that therapist needs to hear from somebody and learn not to say that. But it's also okay to find another therapist. I also find grief support groups are really great. There's a bunch in our state. If you are interested in one specifically, shoot me an email after this and I will send you some in your area. Sometimes that's a great place to be because there are other people that are in that stage that aren't going to push because their goal is to be in this with you and you to be in it with them. So I find that can be a really great environment. Chores, pulling weeds, cutting lawns. There are a lot of grief groups actually. They're spread all over Utah. There's some that are virtual, there's some that are in person, there's some specifically for suicide, there's some specifically for spouses. It just varies on what's available in your area. But if that's something you're interested in, please do shoot me an email, shoot Heather an email. I'd be happy to figure out which one's in your area so that you can find the right one. Some areas are a little more difficult to find those in-person ones, and so virtual is what's available. But yeah, they are absolutely grief support groups, and they're grief support groups for kids. I used to work for one a few years back, and those are great. Whew. Yep, lost your mom 2 years ago. I'm so sorry. Yeah, I'm glad you're starting to enjoy those habits. So a question on leaving early. You do get credit for being present. So we took roll. You'll get a copy of these slides. So no worries. If you gotta go, you gotta go. I know that we're getting really close to time. Oh, the decision fatigue. Yes. Sometimes just taking on making decisions with folks, it really does help. I mentioned earlier all that red tape stuff. Sometimes being willing to help them figure out what to do for a funeral. My advice, honestly, if you have to figure out what to do for a funeral, if it wasn't written for you, which as a person I recommend, write down exactly what you want. It really helps your family out. But if not, take someone with you that is not connected to that loss because they're the ones that are going to help you not get so overwhelmed with emotion that you make a choice that you regret later. It's really helpful. I also find that having someone that just is there with you so that if you lose it, they can continue the conversation with that funeral director or that priest, whoever it might be, because we need that space sometimes. Anticipatory loss during a medical condition, this impacts families a lot. This could be all kinds of things. This could be cancer. These could be juvenile conditions. There's a lot of things. It changes the family dynamic, sometimes permanently. We did do a presentation on anticipatory grief at the beginning of the year. That's available on YouTube or our app if you guys want to watch that. But it's something to really consider with at-home grief. It's a real impact, even if the person doesn't ultimately die from that condition, it is still a very real thing. Taboo loss, so that's going to be our presentation, I think, next time. So these are some forms of taboo loss, losses that we have trouble talking about beyond the other two I just mentioned. So these are things that we're going to talk about in that next presentation, and some of them might end up with their own presentation if there's enough interest in those things.